So to start off, I'd like to hear from all of you, starting with you, David, about your funding program and what makes it different from your colleagues. And friends, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paula. Thanks, obviously, for everybody for being here today. Really appreciate it. We were just saying earlier, it's nice to be back in person at these things. I think coming out of COVID, we all have a new appreciation for getting to actually see people, and so a huge thank you to everybody for being here today, and to Bloomberg. So look, the Canada CMHC program, CMB program, which is the program that we run, is a $60 billion a year funding program, so Canadian dollars only. So not obviously not as interesting as my colleagues here who are issuing in different currencies, but I think still a pretty exciting program in Canada. We're about $265 billion outstanding, so quite a large program by global standards. I think programs played a key role in the mortgage funding market in Canada for quite a few years now, since 2001. So, including, I would say, more recently, from a policy point of view, helping with create affordable mortgage supply for multifamily housing in Canada. So.
Okay. What about you, Flora?
Yes, so first, thank you for having us. IFC is the International Finance Corporation. We are part of the World Bank Group, but we do have a separate funding program, separate balance sheet, and so in terms of size, we issue about $15 billion a year, which is quite smaller than both my colleagues here. But we do issue in various markets across the globe, and Canada is one of our very important markets. Overall, we have about $60 billion outstanding, and as I mentioned, we're about $15 billion per year. In terms of what the funds go to, we ultimately issue the bonds, and the funding goes to private sector companies in emerging markets. And ultimately, we're trying to serve our mission, which is poverty alleviation and increasing income prosperity.
And how is that mission different from yours?
No, well, our mission is the same. It's the same. The difference being, and I represent two issuers as well, and that's IBRD and IDA. IBRD, everybody sort of understands colloquially as the World Bank, been around since 1944, and a big issuer. The funding program's between 50 to 55 billion a year. And IDA is a relatively new entrant into the capital market. Its inaugural is in 2018. IDA was initially set up as a sort of funded through donors, through sovereign donors, and it focuses specifically on the poorest countries, and sort of built up a massive equity, and then eventually sort of wanted to leverage and do more by accessing the capital markets. IDA does some more concessional lending, grants, other things to focus on those needs. But the mission's the same across our institutions.
And could you share with us your strategies for issuing bonds in the Canadian market? And how does the cross-currency basis, asset liability management, and the need for market opportunities play into that? And also, how do you ensure there is liquidity for your product?
All very good questions.
Yeah, so please go ahead.
So our IBRD, our funding program is quite large. So our first goal is to build as diverse of an investor base as possible. So for IBRD, we issue in anywhere between 20 to 30 currencies a year. All of that gets hedged back to dollar because our balance sheet is managed against dollar. So again, it's a matter of just building as much of an investor base as you can. In Canada, Canada is a very important donor to the World Bank as well, shareholder. We've been I think we can brag a little bit politely that we've been doing benchmark issuances in Canada for about 13 years.
With IBRD?
Yes, IBRD.
IDA is yet to issue a maple bond, right?
That's correct. Not for lack of wanting to. I think the idea is that we want to keep the regulatory treatment between the two exactly the same. So we haven't managed to do that for IDA just yet. But when we can do that, we'll move forward.
Any idea when that could be?
No. I was hoping yesterday or last year. But no, I mean, we're working on a few things. We're just trying to get the exact regulatory treatment. I think, you know, things sometimes the government move quite slowly, and I think that's where we're kind of stuck at the moment. But in terms of the overall program, just being as diverse as possible.
And what about you, Flora? What's your strategy for issuing Maple bonds?
It's very similar to IBRD. However, as I mentioned before, our program is much smaller. So we have made an interesting strategic decision to not issue in euros. However, we have issued CAD, and we are committed to Canadian dollar issuing a benchmark at least once every fiscal year. And we have done that since 2018. And so the reason that we've stayed out of euros is that we definitely do our dollar benchmark once a year or twice a year, depending. We have Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, New Zealand dollar, and of course sterling. And because, again, our size is small, we want to make sure we're present in each of those markets regularly. And with that, we can get the investor diversification that we're talking about.
Any specific steps you take to ensure there is liquidity when you do issue?
In Canadian dollars? Yeah, so we, well, one, I think just laying the groundwork, we do a lot of investor relations in Canada. Arguably, we're very easy to, you know, it's very easy to visit the investors of our neighbors. But by laying out the groundwork, we really then talk to investors and see what the needs are of investors. We do try to maintain a curve. It's not always easy given investor demand and what we need on our balance sheet if we're looking to essentially match the term of our lending program. And so I think, of course, working with the investors, maintaining a curve, but ultimately we do have to be mindful of the cross-currency basis, which you mentioned. Having said that, we have issued Canadian dollar at or above our US dollar curve because of the importance of ensuring that we're frequent in the market, or relatively frequent in the market.
What would you like to add?
Look, I'll put my investor hat on for a sec. I love, obviously, I love when, you know, we love seeing the SSA Maples come to market. So, you know, I think it's great for the Canadian market to have that diversity of issuance, especially if the price is right on it. It's even better. You know, look, with my issuer add-on, you know, I think as folks probably know, with the CMB program, we are a very programmatic issuer, so we issue 8 times a year. You know, we don't take an opportunistic view on it. Our view is, look, we do large benchmark issues 8 times a year. We come to market regardless of what's going on in the world. You know, we issued during COVID, we issued during GFC, we've issued during you know, some of the toughest markets globally ever. You know, I think we got a $10 billion deal done during the week Lehman's failed. So I think, you know, that was just one of the, you know, sort of testaments to how strong this program is globally. And I think, again, from our, you know, our approach to issuance is we always want to be there, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean we're always going to get the best price, but it's much more important from an overall stability perspective that we are in the market 8 times a year with those large deals.
And I understand that overseas investors' demand has somewhat faded a bit over the last year. How are you dealing with that, and are you seeing any signs of improvement? Yep,
no, great question, Paula. So absolutely, we, you know, as folks probably know, we went through a consultation process last year. It did create some uncertainty around the program. You know, in the end, there was a great decision, I think, was made to obviously keep the program. The program's actually larger than where it had been. So again, we went from 40 billion to 60 billion mortgages funded per year now, so 50% larger. Yeah, I think what we did see last year, and it wasn't a huge surprise, was with that uncertainty, we saw a dip in our international investor base. So we saw that historically we were around 30-35% of our primary book would go to international accounts. It fell to around 20 last year. First half of the year, we were still pretty slow to recover. I would say we started seeing more accounts coming back in terms of unique names, but the percentage was still quite low. So we were around 20-22%. You know, I'm going to say, honestly, we spoke to our syndicate kind of mid-year point of the year, and we said, look, where the numbers, the international numbers were lower than where we wanted to see them, and I think kudos to our syndicate. In the 2 deals since that, we've actually seen a very nice uptick in our international distribution. So the August 10-year trade, we saw nearly 40%, which was maybe a bit of an anomaly, but quite good. And even the recent 5-year deal in September, we saw 25%. So we're seeing the overall percentages coming up, which is great. I think as we get out and speak with investors, obviously great being in New York this week, speaking to a lot of folks, just letting people know that that we are obviously still in business. We haven't changed our approach to how we issue. As I mentioned, 8 times a year, still very programmatic. I think as we're getting that word out, it's starting to show up in the data. So.
And as you said, you're very programmatic, and you all look to issue very often. So no matter how bad or good things are, you're out there. And how do you navigate, central banks that are not as unsynchronized as we would have hoped? And, your international investor base shrunk a bit. So how do you navigate these markets, and what kind of actions do you take in terms of sizing of the deals or maturity, or, what do you do?
So I think for us, I actually think we're somewhat agnostic on that, as strange as it sounds. And I did sort of allude to it earlier that we really are all about that get to the market 8 times a year. And again, it's obviously I always care about price as an issuer, but we are somewhat agnostic to that. It's much more important that we get to the market. Our syndicate truly works very hard, and I believe the model we use, I think, is quite effective, because the syndicate sales desks work extremely hard to build very strong, robust books. We're generally very predictable in terms of the size of our deals that are coming, so syndicates will build those books in advance. So we're quite comfortable with those levels, and I think we just need to demonstrate to the market that we're going to keep doing that. Nothing's changed.
What about you, Flora?
Yes, so we have a global presence with our funding team. So we have people in Singapore, in London, a person in Japan, and then, of course, in Washington, D.C. And what we do is basically on a daily basis, we're coordinating and monitoring the various markets to see what makes sense in terms of pricing, investor demand, and the like. And I think what we do is we look at that, but we also look at the needs of our our other side of the balance sheet, our asset side, our RPMs having opportunities to invest the funds that we issue, sits in liquidity before it's dispersed to our clients. And so I think looking internally with our asset side, coordinating amongst the team, we then ultimately look for the best opportunities with what we talked about earlier, with the idea of ensuring that we're still in each market frequently enough to remain liquid and recognized by investors.
The last time you issued was in August 2023, so you haven't issued this fiscal year yet.
That's right.
Does that mean that demand is not quite there yet?
I would say right now it is more of a cross-currency basis. The last time I looked this morning, I think we're probably 5 basis points away on the 5-year point. Last fiscal year, when we did issue our Canadian dollar, it was a green bond. It was $1 billion in size, which was the largest we had ever done at that point, and it was 3-year. And so if we were to look this year, which we are looking, we would potentially look to go a little longer. We do believe that the Canadian market, the investors are very interested in sustainably labeled bonds. So whether it's green or social, that is something we'd absolutely consider as well.
Should we expect an issue over the coming months then? Because your
pressure is on. The pressure is on. No, like I said, we are very much committed. And if it's slightly above our dollar curve, we can live with that. And ultimately, like I said before, we also look at the asset side. If there are assets that can be, our PMs can be investing in, we're looking ultimately at the spread. So yes, I am very hopeful that we will issue this fiscal year.
Should we expect some issuance from one of your 2 entities as well? in Canadian
We
dollars?
would love to issue in Canadian dollar denominated bonds as much as is feasible, and we've made that a priority. We were able to do a 1.4 billion in January. We've been monitoring since. Still a little offsides in trying to get that done, but we keep monitoring that. And January always somehow tends to work somehow, so we can certainly look towards that and do as much as we can. I mean.
And when you mentioned that the international investor demand is getting up there, any kind of specific investors, like region-wise or sort of type of investors that are particularly interested in Canada these days?
Yeah, so look, we've seen the pickup we've seen this year, I would say, has been U.S. based. So obviously, a lot of our friends here in New York, it's been great to see those numbers come back up. I'd say Europe has also been quite good for us this year. So we've seen a really nice resurgence out of Europe. We have done some targeted investor relations into those areas, and I do find that works, right? It's just getting in front of people, particularly the central banks. Often, with sometimes the CAD portforders, there's you'll have PMs turning over in those fairly regularly. Getting in and talking to the new folks is quite important, and it does deliver orders. So yeah, it's been quite positive on that front.
And would that make any sense for you to issue in different currencies?
So for us, we're strictly Canadian dollars. So we're not set up to issue in any other currencies. We have no intention of issuing in other currencies. I think, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, the policy mandate of this program is to support the Canadian housing finance system, the stability of that, which obviously is a Canadian dollar system. And I think, again, I think that the program's proven to be able to do that fairly efficiently in Canadian dollars. So there's really no need to look at other currencies. And I think, again, from that policy point of view, it's also been extended now to really put a push on with the affordable housing issue in Canada and really trying to fund more multifamily housing. So, if we look at the increase last year that the government gave us, that incremental $20 billion is directed solely towards multifamily housing, which, for anyone that's in Canada, they realize that housing affordability has become a very big issue. So, this program has been doing its small part to certainly help with that.
Please keep up. Talking about supporting the domestic market, how do you see the big Canadian pension funds issuing more and more often in the domestic market? And does that have any influence on your decisions?
Yeah, so I was listening to the panel earlier, and I think a lot of the goals that CDPQ and Ontario's have, it's very similar to ours, right? Investor diversification, and of course the pricing and whatnot. And I think there's enough demand, at least currently, to service all of us. We are, I think, complementary to the pension funds and whatnot, rather than a direct competitor. So I think ultimately with more issuers, it will create more interest in Canadian dollar, in the Canadian dollar market.
How do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's been the last couple of years, it's been higher, and I kind of expect that to stay pretty static going forward. I don't think that really would affect demand for a maple issuance. I think it's really more just getting the pricing right for us, because I sense that there would be certainly interest if that works for us. So I don't see it really affecting the demand for an IBRD issuance at all.
What about you?
Yeah, look, we love diversity of issuance in Canada for sure. I think it's great to see the pensions active again. We love seeing the SSAs bring maples. I really think the more of that issuance is happening, it's beneficial for all of us as issuers.
Much has been said about CORA as a floater, and I wanted to hear from you guys. What are your views, and what is the importance of pre-selling bonds to make sure such an issue could actually happen? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, for us, again, part of the diversification story, we like to do as many different instruments as we can. We like to try to be innovative. So a CORA issuance, I think, would be great. I mean, for us, we'd like to sort of lend or show support to these new sort of financial benchmarks. And we did that with dollar SOFR as well. We were the first benchmark issuance in dollar SOFR back in 2018. Today, we've issued about 25 billion of dollar SOFR. And at the beginning, it was very nascent and new, and that's really developed into a pretty significant market now. And so for Cora, I think we'd love to take the same opportunity. I know, we've looked at it, we keep looking at it. I don't see any reason. It'd be right up our alley to try to support something like that.
So maybe your next issuance could be Courage?
Could be. We'll see.
What about you, Flora?
Yeah, I would say we probably want to walk before we could run. So we do look to our big sister, if you will, to issue the Cora. Having said that, we have seen investor interest when we go to the meetings that we've had, particularly in Canada. There has been interest in Cora. So it's something that we definitely keep an eye on, but I would say it is not immediately in our funding, I guess, options at this point.
Yeah, so Cora for us is, we were fairly heavily involved in the transition. I think we're sort of considered the only regular Cora issuer in Canada, and I think we do take that role quite seriously. I think as folks may or may not have heard, we are going to make a slight change to our program next year, not in terms of necessarily the sizing, but we will likely only do the Cora 2 times per year next year instead of 4 times. So, expect to see, less frequent issuance, but I would say sizing very similar to what we've been doing in total before.
Why this adjustment?
Look, I think it's a function of the order books. We know it is a very specific investor base on it, so we don't generally see a lot of depth in those books, but the investors, those investors do generally show up on those trades. So, try to target larger, more liquid deals. So do that twice a year instead of spreading them out over 4. So just help with the liquidity a little bit, make for a little bit bigger benchmark sizes.
And if I can just add, if we're looking at the current interest rates and the direction they're going in, it could also impact the demand in the product as well.
Okay. Well, the time is shouting at us, so I'd like to thank all of you, and that's it.
Thank you very much.